You're 70 years old. Your hands ache, your back is bent from decades of labor, and yet tomorrow morning, you will wake up before dawn and go back to work, because there is no other option. No pension check arriving in the mail. No gold watch and a party. No cruise ship waiting at the dock. For more than 10,000 years of human history, this was simply what it meant to grow old. You worked until your body gave out, and then, if you were lucky, your children took care of you. If you were unlucky, you had nothing at all. The idea that a person could stop working in their 60s and simply live, funded by decades of savings or a government check, is not an ancient tradition passed down through the ages. It is a strange and remarkably recent invention, barely a century old, and it was built almost by accident out of a very specific set of political panics, economic disasters, and one German chancellor who was mostly just trying to stop his country from turning socialist. So how did we get from working until death to gold watches and golf courses in Arizona? And why does it feel like that whole system might be quietly falling apart right now? Let's go back to the beginning, to a world where retirement wasn't just uncommon. It didn't exist at all. Start with ancient Greece and Rome, two civilizations we tend to romanticize as sophisticated and advanced, and in many ways they were. But if you were an ordinary farmer, a potter, a blacksmith, or a craftsman in these societies, there was no such thing as stepping away from your trade. You worked because working was how you ate. There was no safety net waiting for you, no institution designed to catch you when your strength failed. Support, when it came at all, came from one place only, and that was your family. Children were expected, as a matter of basic survival and often religious duty, to care for their aging parents. If you had no children, or your children had died, or they simply refused, you were in serious trouble. Old age in the ancient world was not a reward for a life of hard work. It was a vulnerability, something to be managed within the household, because there was no institution outside of it that would step in. There was, however, one glaring exception to this rule, and it's a fascinating one, because it shows us that the concept of a pension isn't actually new at all. It just used to be reserved for a very specific group of people. The Roman military. If you served in the Roman legions for 20 to 25 years, and you survived, the empire would reward you. Sometimes this came as a plot of farmland you could settle on and work for yourself. Sometimes it came as a lump sum payment, a kind of ancient severance package. This wasn't generosity for its own sake. Rome needed loyal, well-trained soldiers, and dangling a secure future in front of them was one of the most effective ways to keep an army disciplined and willing to fight far from home for decades at a time. In a sense, this is the ancestor of every military pension system that exists today, and it's worth sitting with that for a second. The very first organized retirement system in Western history wasn't for the elderly in general. It was a recruitment and retention tool for soldiers. Move over to ancient China, and you find a completely different philosophy governing old age, one rooted deeply in Confucian tradition. The concept was called filial piety, and it wasn't just a nice sentiment, it was practically a moral law. Children were expected to honor, obey, and financially support their parents as they aged, and this obligation was baked into the culture at every level, reinforced through literature, ritual, and social expectation. The government, for its part, didn't typically hand out money to the elderly, but it would sometimes offer symbolic honors, things like a specially carved walking cane granted to elders who reached a certain advanced age, a small but meaningful gesture that said, "This person has earned respect." But make no mistake, the actual burden of care, the food, the shelter, the day-to-day support, fell on the family. The state's role was to encourage and celebrate that duty, not to replace it. Now let's jump forward to medieval Europe, because this is where we start to see something that looks a little bit more like what we might call retirement today, even though it wasn't called that and it wasn't really optional. In medieval villages and towns, elderly workers didn't simply stop laboring. Instead, their work was repurposed. A blacksmith whose arms could no longer swing a heavy hammer might shift to lighter tasks, sharpening tools instead of forging them. A woman who had spent decades doing heavy household labor might transition into spinning wool, mending clothes, or preparing meals, tasks that were still valuable but far less physically punishing. This was a flexible, almost organic system, built around the extended family and the rhythms of village life, where multiple generations often lived under one roof or at least in close proximity. But what happened if you had no family? What happened if your children had died, or moved away, or simply couldn't take you in? For those people, the safety net was the church. Almshouses, charitable institutions often run by religious orders, took in the elderly poor as a last resort. It wasn't a comfortable life, and it certainly wasn't dignified in the way we might hope, but it was something. A roof, some food, a place to die that wasn't the side of a road. This was the model for most of human history. Flexible, family-centered, informal, and precarious. And then the Industrial Revolution came along and shattered it completely. Here's where the story takes a dark turn, because the rise of the factory did something that thousands of years of agricultural and craft-based economies never did. It disconnected work from the human body's natural pace of aging. Think about the old model for a moment. A farmer who was slowing down could still plant seeds, even if he couldn't plow a full field in a day. A craftsman with arthritic hands could still teach an apprentice, still do lighter finishing work. The work adjusted to the person. But a factory machine does not slow down for anyone. It runs at a fixed speed, hour after hour, and if you cannot keep pace with it, you are not just less productive, you are actively dangerous, both to yourself and to the people working around you. Industrial machinery had no patience for stiff joints or slower reflexes. Older workers who had once been valued for their experience were now viewed as liabilities, prone to injury, prone to slowing down the line, and increasingly, they were simply let go. At the exact same time, something else was happening that made this crisis even worse. Urbanization was pulling families apart. In the old agricultural world, multiple generations often lived together, or at least nearby, in the same village their families had occupied for generations. But the Industrial Revolution pulled young workers into crowded, fast-growing cities in search of factory jobs, while their aging parents were often left behind in rural areas, or worse, followed them into the city only to find that cramped urban tenement housing had no room and no role for an elderly relative who could no longer work. The extended family safety net that had held for centuries was fraying badly, and for the first time in history, large numbers of elderly people found themselves with no work, no family support, and no institution to catch them. The result was the workhouse, sometimes called the poorhouse, and these were not gentle places. They were often designed deliberately to be harsh and unpleasant, on the theory that if conditions were too comfortable, people would choose to rely on charity rather than work. Families were frequently separated inside these institutions. Elderly residents labored at menial tasks in exchange for the most basic food and shelter. It was, for many old people in the 19th century, the grim final chapter of a hard life. Something had to change. And it did, but not for the reasons you might expect. The invention of the modern government pension didn't come from a wave of pure compassion sweeping across Europe. It came from politics, and specifically, it came from fear. In Germany, in 1889, the country's powerful chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, was watching a socialist political movement grow rapidly in strength, fueled in large part by the very real suffering of industrial workers, including the elderly poor languishing in poverty. Bismarck was no friend of socialism. He despised it. But he was a shrewd enough political operator to understand that if he wanted to undercut the socialists' appeal, he needed to steal their best ideas before they could fully capitalize on them. So he created the world's first national old age pension program, a system where workers who paid into the program could receive a government benefit once they reached a certain age. That age, notably, was set at 70. And here's the detail that reveals exactly how calculated this move really was. At the time, average life expectancy in Germany was somewhere around 45 years old. Bismarck wasn't creating a generous system designed to give millions of workers decades of leisure. He was creating a system that looked good on paper, diffused a political threat, and in practice, paid out benefits to a relatively small number of people who actually lived long enough to collect them. It was, in many ways, a masterstroke of political theater dressed up as social reform. Decades later, in 1916, the qualifying age was lowered to 65, and that number would go on to echo through pension systems around the entire world for the next century. The idea crossed the Atlantic, but it took an economic catastrophe to actually take root in the United States. That catastrophe was the Great Depression. By the early 1930s, the American economy had collapsed so completely that roughly half of all elderly Americans found themselves living in poverty, with no savings, no work, and often no family able to support them either, since everyone was struggling at once. This wasn't a hypothetical crisis affecting a small unlucky minority. It was a massive, visible, national emergency, playing out in breadlines and shanty towns across the country. In response, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act in 1935, establishing a system where American workers would pay into a fund throughout their working lives and then receive monthly benefit checks once they reached the age of 65. This wasn't just a policy tweak. It was a fundamental reimagining of what society owed its oldest members, and it planted the seed for an entirely new phase of life that simply had not existed before on any large scale. A phase of life where you could stop working and still have an income. A phase of life that we would eventually come to call retirement, and then came the Golden Age. In the decades following World War II, the American economy entered a period of extraordinary growth, and that growth reshaped what old age could look like. Corporations began offering private pension plans as a way to attract and retain workers in a competitive labor market. Labor unions fought hard and successfully for retirement benefits as a core part of their negotiations with employers. For the first time in human history, a large segment of the population, specifically working and middle-class men in industrialized nations, could reasonably expect to stop working in their 60s and live comfortably for years afterward, not through family support, not through charity, but through a combination of government checks and employer pensions they had earned over a lifetime of labor. This new reality created entirely new industries and entirely new places. Sun City, Arizona opened in 1960 as one of the very first retirement communities built specifically for active older adults, and it was wildly successful, becoming a model copied across the country. Suburbs expanded to accommodate aging homeowners. A senior travel industry blossomed, offering cruises and package tours aimed specifically at retirees with time and money on their hands. Retirement wasn't just a financial arrangement anymore. It had become a cultural identity, a whole imagined lifestyle of leisure, golf courses, grandchildren, and well-earned rest. The numbers tell the story of just how dramatic this shift really was. Back in 1900, roughly 75% of American men over the age of 65 were still in the labor force, still working in some capacity. By 1985, that number had collapsed to just about 16%. In less than a century, growing old had been completely transformed, from a life sentence of labor until death, into an expected and celebrated phase of rest. But here's the uncomfortable truth that brings us right up to today. That golden age, the one so many of us grew up assuming was simply how things worked, was actually a historical anomaly, a fairly brief and fragile window rather than a permanent achievement. And right now, in real time, that window appears to be closing. Starting in the late 1970s, corporations began shifting away from traditional pension plans, the kind where the company guaranteed you a fixed monthly payment for life, and toward individual retirement accounts, most famously the 401k. This might sound like a minor technical change, but it represented an enormous transfer of risk. Under the old pension model, if the stock market crashed or the company mismanaged its investments, that was the employer's problem to solve. Under the new 401k model, that risk shifted entirely onto individual workers, who now had to manage their own investments, hope the market performed well, and pray they saved enough, all without the guarantees their parents' generation had enjoyed. At the same time, a massive demographic shift was quietly building in the background, one that has nothing to do with policy choices and everything to do with basic biology and birth rates. People today are living significantly longer than they did even 50 years ago, which sounds like wonderful news, and in many ways it is. But longer lives mean more years of retirement benefits need to be paid out per person. Meanwhile, birth rates have been declining steadily across most developed nations, which means there are fewer young workers entering the workforce to pay into these systems in the first place. The math here is genuinely alarming when you look at it directly. In the United States back in 1950, there were roughly 16 working adults paying into Social Security for every single retiree drawing benefits from it. 16 workers supporting one retiree. Today, that ratio has collapsed to somewhere around 3 workers for every one retiree. That is not a small shift. That is a fundamental structural crisis, decades in the making, and it explains why conversations about the solvency of Social Security and pension systems around the world have grown so much louder and so much more urgent in recent years. And so we arrive at a strange, almost circular moment in this whole story. All around the world today, rising costs of living, shrinking pension guarantees, and growing uncertainty about the future of government safety nets are pushing more and more seniors back into the workforce, whether by necessity or by choice. Some are picking up part-time consulting work. Others are taking retail jobs, driving for rideshare apps, or simply delaying retirement altogether because they cannot afford to stop. In a strange and almost poetic way, we may be circling back towards something that would have looked entirely familiar to a Roman farmer, a medieval craftsman, or a 19th century factory worker. Namely, that for most of human history, growing old and stopping work were never actually the same thing. The 20th century gave us a remarkable, historically unprecedented gift, a few decades where millions of ordinary people could genuinely expect rest at the end of a long working life. Whether that gift survives into the rest of this century, in anything like its current form, remains one of the biggest open questions facing nearly every industrialized nation on Earth. What began as Otto von Bismarck's clever political maneuver to outflank socialists in 19th century Germany somehow grew into a defining feature of modern life. And now, more than a century later, we may be watching that same invention slowly, quietly, come full circle.